Helldivers 2 is a sequel to an incredibly well-received cult classic game. The original Helldivers had over 90% positive reviews on Steam and was released around 9 years ago. Taking on some drastic and daring changes, the second iteration aims to maintain all of the democracy-delivering, gun-toting, friendly fire-filled co-op chaos that the first game nailed in a brand new perspective. In this video, I'll take a look at what Helldivers 2 does well, where it could improve, and ultimately whether it's worth the asking price of $39.99 in US dollars. I've done a couple of other reviews on recent releases, so if you enjoy the review or it helps you make up your mind, drop the video a like and subscribe for more like this. Okay, so first things first, let's take a look at the biggest change from the original in Helldivers 2, and that's the view perspective. Now, if you're not familiar with Helldivers, the first game was essentially a top-down shooter, so to come from that into a third-person view perspective is a pretty sweeping change. This is going to be something that all comes down to personal taste, obviously, but as a big fan of the first game, I can absolutely and wholeheartedly say that this view perspective alone has made a major impact on the game. And in my opinion, it's a positive one. Combined with the very obvious graphical updates and some pretty good map design, it immerses you in the setting in ways that the first game just couldn't have hoped to achieve. And if you've never played the first one, this likely won't be something to even worry about. My only gripe with the maps so far is that because you're liberating a small selection of planets at a time, you're locked into a few different environments, and this can get a bit samey if you're playing for an extended period of time. That said, it's cool knowing that there's more maps that will drip feed that fresh experience from seeing new areas. There's no denying it really, whichever side you're on in the view perspective debate, the game looks beautiful. Surprisingly, it runs like an absolute dream as well. I run a 3070 graphics card and a Ryzen 3800X CPU, so not top of the line but still pretty good, and most of my settings defaulted to high or medium. It looks stunning and runs smoothly, to the point I've just not felt the need to adjust the settings at all, and that's pretty rare for me. I'm not sure how this runs on lower end rigs, but the recommended specs on Steam are a 2060 GPU with an i7-9700K or an AMD Ryzen 3700X. It's definitely more CPU intensive, but it has relatively low specs for this type of game, and the minimum specs are even lower than these. This should be a nice surprise for those running lower end rigs. Now, perhaps the biggest debate for Helldivers isn't the view perspective at all. It's something that has divided gamers ever since it became a reality. Helldivers uses nprotect GameGuard, which is a kernel-level access anti-cheat. This is an incredibly divisive thing when it comes to video games, and whilst I don't want to get into the politics behind the decision or whether or not I agree with it in this video, it is something that's important to know for consumers. Do your research on whether this bothers you before you think about purchasing, so that you can make an informed decision. The only other thing to be aware of on the technical side is that there have been quite a lot of reports of crashes and connection issues for matchmaking. Now, I can only speak for PC players in this regard, as I don't own a PlayStation, but for me and around 10 friends that I've been playing with actively, we played with a full party for over 15 hours of game time, and we haven't experienced more than about 2 crashes in a 15-minute period where we couldn't connect to each other's games. As far as launches go, that's a pretty acceptable amount of downtime for me, and I'd assume that the developers will see this as a priority since a high number of reports have come in. The main problem when it comes to connectivity seems to be stemming from matchmaking and quick play, not when you've got a pre-made party. At the end of the day, this is just my experience and everyone's PC is different, so if you experience crashes or connection issues, don't be afraid to request a refund and wait for them to be fixed before jumping back in. Okay, so that's the technical bits out of the way. Now let's get into how the game actually plays. First and foremost, all of the Starship Troopers style satirical humor is very much still there in the Helldivers sequel. You're going to be hearing about so much democracy, liberty, and freedom that you'll be sure you can hear a bald eagle shedding a tear in the distance after your first few games. And how exactly are we dispensing democracy? With highly explosive ordnance and fire support options like these. Let's put it this way, if you have have a sexual attraction to napalm, high explosives, or long-distance artillery, you are in for a treat with Helldivers. You have access to all sorts of ordnance that can make for some spectacular light shows as bug bits fly off into the distance. If being a lifeline for your team is more your thing though, that's an option too, with items like the resupply backpack and advanced weaponry such as the recoilless rifle allowing 2-man reloads. You're never going to feel like a spare part, even if you decide not to go for an outright offensive build. The diversity of stratagems available allows you to tackle threats in a variety of ways depending on what suits you. The same applies to your average weaponry, with everything from conventional weapons like assault rifles, marksman rifles and SMGs, all the way to arc throwers that fire charged lightning at the enemies, and rail guns that will drive a hole through even the toughest bug hide. All of this is aided by some stellar sound design both in the soundtrack and in-game sound effects. The weapons are punchy, and you feel that in the audio, not to mention the shockwaves that you'll feel rattling through you at times when explosions occur. Combat, as you might expect from a third-person shooter, is an absolute masterpiece in Helldivers that brings together multiple aspects in the best kind of way. I mean, to really send this home, just take a look at what launching a local ICBM is like for yourself, and you tell me how it makes you react.
Calling in an Eagle, calling in an orbital strike. You have ignited the torches of liberty. Extraction awaits.
Now, let's take a brief look at how the weapons and stratagems are acquired, and stick with me on this because there are 4 different types of currency in Helldivers. First, you've got samples. These are acquired in missions and can be used to make upgrades on your ship that will provide bonuses to you directly, things like reducing your cooldowns or giving you extra magazines for your weapons. After these comes requisition slips. Requisition is essentially used to purchase the stratagems you'll use in missions. Fire support, turrets, support weapons that occupy a 3rd weapon slot, and so on. These are acquired from successfully completing missions, and you'll get more of these based on several factors like how many additional objectives you completed and how many of you survived. Next is medals, which can be found in missions too, but are primarily acquired from completing the missions themselves. The higher the difficulty, the more objectives there are in a local area, and the bigger the cache of medals you'll stand to gain. These are used to unlock cosmetics and weaponry from what is essentially a Battle Pass model. There's an additional version of the Battle Pass which comes with the Super Citizen edition of the game. You can also purchase that upgrade separately for just under $20, or you can buy it with the 4th currency available in the game, known as Super Credits. Super Credits are the premium currency and can be purchased for real-world money, but before that scares you off, you'll also want to know that these Super Credits can be earned in-game. You can find them in missions or use medals to buy them in the original Battle Pass. The higher your progress in the Battle Pass, the more these credits are going to cost. But it's a pretty good balance and stops things from being pay to win, more pay to skip. On top of all that, the Super Credits are essentially only used for purchasing the Premium Battle Pass, not the items within it, and for cosmetic items that rotate on a 48-hour schedule. So it's not really going to give you any meaningful upgrades, just unlock more cosmetics or progressional aspects to buy with the regular currencies. Progression, in this sense, overall is well thought out, and whilst there are a number of currencies to keep track of, you'll soon get your head around it and figure out how to use them efficiently. It gives you multiple things to aim for, and you're always looking for that next unlock, which is good fun for those that like to have a bit more of a purpose in their games than just shooting stuff. Okay, we've talked a lot about you as the player and your experience, but what about the enemies that you'll go up against? In Helldivers 2 right now, you'll face the Terminids and the bots. For those that have played the first game, the bots seem to basically be an updated version of the cyborgs. A lot of the enemies look very similar. That said, there was actually an additional third faction in the original Helldivers known as the Illuminates, and there's some speculation that we'll likely see those in a future DLC. Now, 2 factions doesn't seem like a lot, and arguably, you're right, it isn't. But there's also enough diversity within these factions themselves that you'll be going up against new threats with different weak points, different strengths, and different abilities as you increase the difficulty level. Each time you increase, you're more likely to see the larger bugs and the more armored variants of the bots. This could make combat incredibly rewarding, because as you push to higher levels, you're encountering new threats and having to learn how best to deal with them. You'll get into the swing of things after a while and start to know exactly where to hit the enemy to pack the biggest punch, which can be very satisfying in instances where you're toppling heavy bots by shooting out their knees or putting an anti-material rifle round straight through the mouth of a large bug to see them swiftly dealt with. Helldivers 2 is a co-op experience, there's no denying that. It has no PvP elements unless you count frequent friendly fire under that banner, and it is best played with a squad of 4 players. If you've got a group of friends that are likely to play with you, you're naturally going to have the best experience with them, since you'll be able to communicate the use of various stratagems and coordinate with one another on how best to deal with certain situations. That said, quick play is available to help you match with teammates, and it maintains that drop-in, drop-out convenience that the original game had. You'll be able to send out an SOS beacon in the missions itself too, to increase the likelihood of other players coming along and supporting you. I believe this is where a lot of the complaints have stemmed from when it comes to multiplayer connectivity, with a lot of players getting disconnected from games and having errors when matching with randoms rather than using pre-built squads. The devs have already pushed one patch as of the 9th of February, with more on the way to help resolve the issue, so if you don't have friends to play with right now, it may be worth holding off for the time being and just waiting to see if this gets fixed in the meantime. Keep in mind that if you do play with random teammates using the matchmaking system, there's a fairly easy to use ping system, and you can even place markers on the map too, so you can coordinate in limited capacity even if you're not a fan of using voice chat. Solo gameplay is viable on the lower difficulties, but realistically, the game was designed to be played as a group, and that's where you'll have the truest Helldivers experience. So if you prefer to play games alone, I don't think this would really be a suitable choice for most people. Now, before I come to the ultimate conclusion on this one, I wanted to touch on something that the developers mentioned in some trailers running up to the game's release. Essentially, they've got a team of human game masters that are spectating various games across the player base, and are supposedly giving them challenges to deal with, as well as some extra support ordnance options, and just generally making the experience better for them with some actual human input. Now, I love this idea, and it's a great thing to have this level of interaction with your player base from the developer's point of view. But with that said, we've not seen an obvious instance of this ourselves in any of our games that we've played across over 15 hours of playtime. That's not to say that it's not a good idea, because it is, but logistically, catering to this many players just means that you aren't going to see this kind of thing very often, if at all. So that brings us to the final conclusion. The game is selling at $39 US. Now that's a pretty steep price point for many players, and if you want to get the extra battle pass, there's just shy of another $20 US on top of that. Now the gameplay, when you're having uninterrupted issues, is just fantastic. The best word to describe it is impactful. Everything you do looks and feels awesome and has some heavy weight to it. Whether it's the light shows that are ordnance-based stratagems, the firearms you're able to put to use in every mission, or even just the cinematic sequence of actually dropping into a match. They've nailed the gameplay, there's no doubt, and that's supported by a pretty good progression system too. The tough part is that a lot of people are having issues actually getting to that gameplay. So my advice here is, yes, it's worth it if you're willing to put up with some of the typical launch problems we've experienced in recent years from video games. We know by now that this sort of thing is usually fixed after some post-launch patches, but right right now, it may be worth holding off if you've not got a dedicated few friends to play with. Overall, it's a stellar experience despite the issues and rings true to what Helldivers is supposed to be: unadulterated, chaotic, liberty dispensing fun. That's it from me in this one, folks. Hopefully you enjoyed the review, and if you have any thoughts on how you found your experience so far, or if you just found this review helpful, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to promote some positive discussion about the game so that other potential players can really feel informed before making their decision. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you all in the next one.